What if the man who gave up the crown for love just decided to leave that love behind for the crown? It all started with silence. Not the kind that comes with peace, but the unnerving quiet of distance. A man once known for his fierce protectiveness over his family, for his spirited loyalty to a woman he gave up a kingdom for, now seemed lost within himself. The cameras weren't rolling, the stage wasn't lit, and for once, there were no stylists, no media handlers, no PR shields. Prince Harry was alone in a Montecito garden, shoulders sunken, eyes hollow, facing a decision that could unravel everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. To the public, it seemed like business as usual. The Sussex brand, though quieter, still lingered in headlines. Meghan was reportedly meeting with Netflix executives for upcoming content discussions. Harry had been seen at a charity polo event in Santa Barbara. From the outside, the narrative appeared intact, maybe even thriving. But behind the high hedges and security gates of their California estate, something had shifted. The man who once said he'd do anything to protect his wife was now whispering about returning home. Alone. This wasn't a rumor. This was a plan. And it began with a message short, urgent, and unmistakably serious, sent not through royal channels, but via encrypted communication, directly to Princess Anne. It read, "I need to speak. Please no staff. Just you. It's about coming home, but not as before." Anne, unshaken as always, reportedly stared at the message for several minutes. She didn't immediately respond. Not out of dismissal, but disbelief. Was this a cry for help? A shift in royal politics? Or something deeper, something broken? The answer would come days later, but by then, Meghan Markle was already panicking. Something was very wrong with Harry, not just emotionally, but physically. Friends close to the couple noticed the weight loss, the long absences, the canceled meetings, and worst of all, the episode. According to one Montecito staff member who asked to remain anonymous, Harry collapsed in the hallway of their home late one evening. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't high. He was simply exhausted, drained from a toxic cocktail of stress, unresolved grief, insomnia, and what some are now calling emotional claustrophobia. Paramedics arrived discreetly. No press, no sirens. But what followed was even more damning than the collapse, a medical diagnosis that would rattle the foundations of the Sussex fairy tale. Prince Harry, once a healthy young soldier who walked behind his mother's coffin with the strength of a nation on his back, was now facing the reality of a serious autoimmune condition, one doctors directly linked to long-term psychological trauma and overwhelming environmental stress. The trigger, they said, wasn't just genetic. It was the lifestyle. The fame, the cameras, the constant attention. What Harry once thought he could control had consumed him. And now, his body was waving the white flag. At the center of this unraveling storm stood Meghan Markle, the woman who had once brought light and rebellion into the heart of the royal family. But this wasn't the story of her glamour or ambition. This was the story of how everything she fought for was now slipping through her fingers, and she couldn't stop it. It began with a confrontation. According to multiple insiders, Meghan had grown increasingly anxious about recent custody documents that had been leaked from a quiet legal inquiry in the UK. She feared that Harry, feeling vulnerable and increasingly distant, might be considering a more permanent separation, not just from her, but from their children. These fears weren't based on fiction. Meghan herself, reportedly in a fit of anger, had once threatened, "If you want to be royal so badly, then be one, without us." Those words, intended as emotional leverage, became the final straw for Harry. He walked out that night. Not dramatically. Not with cameras or chaos. Just silence. He took a short overnight bag, a burner phone, and disappeared to a friend's cabin near Big Sur for nearly 48 hours. No one could reach him. Not Meghan. Not his staff. Not even his therapist. When he returned, something had changed. His voice, once spirited and combative in private debates, had dulled. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply sat Meghan down and said, "I want to serve again. Alone, if I must." She laughed at first, thinking it was a mental spiral talking. But Harry wasn't joking. He had already reached out to Princess Anne. He had already contacted William. And he had already told his medical team that if stepping away from the spotlight meant survival, then he would give up everything: titles, interviews, projects, even her. For Meghan, this was more than a betrayal. This was erasure. She had been through the storms with him, facing royal scrutiny, tabloid abuse, institutional rejection. And now, when the dust had barely settled, he was willing to walk away from the family they built, from the brand they cultivated, from her. Panic quickly turned to damage control. Phone calls were made. Oprah's camp was contacted. Meghan's PR team issued vague public statements about the family focusing on private wellness. But behind closed doors, her strategy was unraveling. Major entertainment partners were growing uneasy. They had signed the Sussexes as a brand, not as individuals. A reclusive Harry meant half the package. And a Harry returning to royal life? That was a complete breach of the narrative. Still, Harry didn't blink. He spent long hours in silence, often walking along the Pacific coast. His doctors had given him a regime: rest, clean eating, zero stress. But Harry knew none of it would work if the emotional source of his pain remained untreated. He didn't need a pill. He needed purpose. And he couldn't find that purpose in podcasts, brand launches, or paparazzi lenses. He needed structure. He needed duty. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once declared freedom from the royal machine. Now, in the shadows of a failing Hollywood dream, he wanted back in. But it wasn't just about missing the crown. It was about his soul. Harry had given everything to escape the institution that scarred him. But in doing so, he had found himself trapped in another machine, one equally cruel, just dressed in palm trees and studio lights. The stress of faking happiness, of maintaining an image, of fighting media narratives with paid PR, it was all eroding the very identity he once tried to build. He no longer wanted to be seen. He wanted to be useful. This was not a prince running away from a wife. This was a man returning to the fire he once escaped, not out of delusion, but survival. And he was willing to risk everything, including his marriage, to get there. Meghan, meanwhile, was left with a crumbling stage. The cameras that once loved her were now skeptical. The allies who once embraced her were distancing themselves. And the man who once swore to protect her from the shadows was now choosing them over her. This wasn't the end of a marriage, not yet. But it was the beginning of a reckoning. One where love, ambition, fame, and identity would clash in a way that no palace scandal had ever done before. And at the center of it all was a silent decision made in a California garden by a man who, for the first time in years, had finally stopped running. He was going home, not with glory, not with applause, but with truth. And that, more than any crown or confession, might be the most dangerous weapon of all. It was supposed to be a quiet evening in Montecito. The kind of night where the winds brush the coastal cliffs and the scent of lemon trees filters through open balcony doors. Inside the Sussex estate, security teams were in place, kitchen staff had retreated for the night, and Archie and Lilibet were reportedly asleep upstairs. But below the serene exterior of this picturesque Californian sanctuary, tension was beginning to simmer. For months, Meghan and Harry had been walking an emotional tightrope. On the surface, their public appearances remained polished. Meghan had recently been photographed wearing a carefully selected ensemble to a charity gala. Harry had appeared on a panel discussion about mental health. But behind those curated moments, arguments had become frequent, often whispered, sometimes shouted, occasionally ending in cold silence. But that night, something snapped. According to multiple accounts from individuals close to the couple, the evening started with a disagreement over logistics. Specifically, the timing of their next public appearance and how to handle the growing tabloid speculation about their children. But as often happens in relationships strained by years of unhealed wounds, the conversation quickly unraveled into something far more dangerous: accusations, fears, and emotional truths that had been buried for far too long. The triggering moment was reportedly a document Harry found on Meghan's desk. It wasn't hidden. In fact, it seemed deliberately left out. It was a legal consultation draft, one that outlined potential custody strategies in the event of a separation. The language was vague, non-committal, and likely intended as a precautionary measure, possibly encouraged by Meghan's legal team. But for Harry, it was a betrayal of the deepest kind. To him, it felt like a preemptive war plan, a declaration that she didn't trust him, or worse, that she was preparing to cut him out. When he confronted her about it, Meghan initially tried to defuse the situation. She said it was standard, that celebrities often prepare for the worst, that it didn't mean anything. But Harry wasn't in a state to hear justification. His world had been slipping for months, his identity, his health, his clarity, and now he was staring at a document that insinuated his children could be taken from him. The fight escalated. Voices rose. Walls that had been cracked now began to collapse. Meghan allegedly accused Harry of emotional abandonment, saying that he had checked out and left her to carry the weight of the public eye. Harry, in turn, accused Meghan of pushing him too far into a life he never wanted, of trading one prison for another. According to one witness close enough to hear fragments through the hallway, Meghan's voice at one point cut through the quiet. "You were a prince. Now you're a product. That was your choice." But the most devastating moment reportedly came when Meghan uttered words that changed everything. "Maybe you should just go back. Be a royal again. If that's what you miss, go. Go alone." To her, it was a jab, a tactic, a way to provoke emotion from a man who had grown increasingly distant. But to Harry, it landed like a bullet. He didn't shout back. He didn't throw anything. He didn't storm off immediately. He simply froze, stared at her, and walked out of the room. Moments later, he went upstairs, packed a small duffel bag, and left the house through the side entrance, avoiding security cameras and alerting no one. Meghan assumed he'd gone for a drive to cool off. But hours passed, then a full night, then another day. By the time the household staff realized Harry hadn't returned, Meghan began making calls. She checked with his therapist, his polo friends, even a security contact in Los Angeles. No one had seen him. He hadn't used his official phone or credit cards. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. In truth, Harry had driven north, hugging the coastline until he reached a secluded cabin owned by a friend, a former army mate who had sworn years ago to always provide him sanctuary if needed. It was a place without Wi-Fi, with spotty phone reception, and no media intrusion. It was where Harry went to think, to breathe, and perhaps to decide whether his life was even survivable in its current state. Inside that cabin, Harry reportedly didn't speak to anyone for almost 36 hours. He wrote. He slept. He walked into the woods. He read through old letters from his mother. And most crucially, he revisited the words that had haunted him in therapy for months. Are you living your own life, or someone else's escape plan? It had been a question posed to him by a trauma counselor during a virtual session in early spring. At the time, he brushed it off. But now, it rang louder than ever. Was his decision to leave the royal family truly his? Or had it been born out of a desire to escape his past without confronting it? He had believed that love was enough, that breaking from the monarchy would bring healing, that distance meant peace. But as he stared into the dense trees beyond the cabin, Harry began to feel a horrifying clarity. He wasn't free. He was simply displaced. And that displacement, geographically, emotionally, spiritually, had begun to consume him from the inside out. When he finally turned his phone back on, there were over 70 missed calls. Meghan had called 17 times. His therapist had called. So had his father's private secretary. But only one message truly stood out. It was a simple one from Princess and, "We need to talk. If you're serious, you must come home." Quietly. It was the first sign of a path back. Not as a prince in exile. Not as a rebel. But as a man ready to start over, not in California, but in the very place he had once fled. When he returned to Montecito, he didn't come back with rage or defiance. According to a staff member who witnessed the homecoming, he looked calm, detached, as if something inside him had gone quiet. Meghan, expecting apologies or at least explanations, was met with a chilling simplicity. Harry reportedly sat down at their breakfast table and said, "I want to serve again. Alone, if I must." That phrase hit harder than anything he could have screamed. It wasn't just about royal duties. It was about identity, about purpose, about Harry's realization that healing wasn't found in brand deals or talk shows. It was found in returning to what made him feel useful: service, discipline, and structure. Meghan reportedly attempted to reason with him. She reminded him of the racism, the press attacks, the betrayal. She recounted the tears, the threats, the trauma they had both endured. But Harry didn't flinch. He simply responded, "I don't want a platform. I want peace." The conversation that followed was long, complex, and deeply emotional. Meghan asked if this meant divorce. Harry said he didn't know. Meghan asked if he would abandon the children. Harry said never. But he made one thing clear. He couldn't stay in the current situation without losing himself completely. It was a line in the sand. And Meghan was on the other side. What made this argument so consequential wasn't just the emotional fracture. It was the fact that, for the first time, Harry had made a decision unilaterally, without consulting Meghan, without strategizing, without worrying about optics. He had found a fragment of his old self, and he was holding on to it like a lifeline. This private fight, which began with custody drafts and scheduling disagreements, now had the weight of a potential separation. Not necessarily legal. Not yet. But spiritual. Existential. Harry wasn't just walking away from a marriage argument. He was walking toward a life he could survive in. And for Meghan, this was perhaps the most devastating moment of all. This wasn't a tabloid scandal or a PR challenge. This was a man, once entirely devoted to her, now saying that his survival might depend on leaving. In the days that followed, Meghan's world began to shift. Conversations with her inner circle turned from image management to crisis containment. Friends began distancing themselves, unsure what side of the story would eventually emerge. Hollywood collaborators went quiet. Meghan's team issued no denials, no confirmations, just a vague statement about personal space and healing journeys. But within the walls of their home, Meghan was now facing a truth even her critics never anticipated. She wasn't being left for another woman. She was being left for silence, for service, for a life without her. And Harry? He was already on the phone with his brother. For the British royal family, discretion is more than a tradition, it is a code. Generations have survived scandal and spectacle by perfecting the art of silence, secrecy, and the subtle exchange of information through carefully chosen intermediaries. But when Prince Harry decided to pick up the phone, not to his father, and not to a palace aide, but directly to Princess, and the move sent a quiet tremor through the inner sanctum of the monarchy. It wasn't just who he called. It was what he said. Harry's voice, according to someone close to his household, carried a mix of desperation and resolve. No dramatics. No self-pity. Just a single, heavy phrase. I want to serve again. Alone, if I must. Princess, and often dubbed the hardest working royal, had no time for nonsense or theatrics. She never chased headlines, never indulged in pity, and had little tolerance for those who fled responsibility. But she had also always maintained a soft spot for Harry, not because she agreed with his decisions, but because she recognized his spirit, the soldier, the son of Diana, the boy who lost his mother and grew up under the crushing weight of a public legacy. And listened carefully. She asked sharp questions. Where are you? Are you being coerced? Is this a passing mood or a real decision? Harry answered each one plainly. No, he wasn't under pressure. No, this wasn't a PR stunt. No, he wasn't seeking a title or favor. He just wanted to be useful again on his terms. Not for Meghan. Not for Netflix. Not for some global rebrand of royalty. For himself. And didn't give an answer that night. She simply told him, if you're serious, you'll speak to William. This isn't just about you anymore. Within 24 hours, Harry made the call. To say the conversation between the two brothers was strained would be an understatement. Years of tension, mistrust, and emotional wounds had calcified into cold civility. After the Oprah interview, William had publicly stated he was very much not a racist, in response to Meghan's insinuations. But privately, he had been far more cutting. He had referred to the interview as a nuclear attack on the family, and had reportedly vowed never to fully trust Harry again. But blood is blood, and when Harry's name lit up William's encrypted line, he answered. The conversation began with a long silence. William waited. Harry cleared his throat. Then, he said, I'm done pretending. I need to come back. Not for press, not for show. I want to be of service again. I want to do something real. William's first instinct was suspicion. Was this another manipulation? A setup for a media leak? Was Meghan behind it? But as the conversation unfolded, something in Harry's voice cut through the years of bitterness. He wasn't rehearsed. He wasn't spinning. He was raw. He spoke of his health, of his collapse, of the doctor's warnings. He admitted to feeling broken, hollowed out by a life he no longer recognized. Most shockingly, he confessed that he and Meghan were drifting apart. Emotionally, spiritually, perhaps permanently. William didn't respond immediately. He listened. Then he asked only one question. Are you willing to come without her? Harry hesitated. But he answered. Yes. That word changed everything. For the first time in years, the palace saw a possibility of reintegration, not of the Sussex brand, but of the individual. A prince stripped of ego. A man no longer playing at Rebbe. Meetings began almost immediately, private and formal, and under layers of secrecy. William contacted Sir Clive Alderton, the king's top private secretary. princess and reached out to her own network within the household to gauge the risks. Not everyone was thrilled. Camilla reportedly expressed concern, warning Charles that allowing Harry back could reignite public divisions and revive painful press narratives. "We've just begun stabilizing," she allegedly said during one internal conversation. "Bringing him back reopens everything." But Charles, ever the conflicted father, was quiet. According to palace insiders, the king was stunned, not by the request itself, but by the tone in which it was made. Gone was the defiant Harry who once stormed out of royal life with accusations and headlines. In his place was a quiet, weary man who said he didn't want titles, privilege, or stage time. He just wanted purpose. The king's private journal reportedly captured his inner turmoil. In one entry, shared discreetly by someone within the palace, Charles wrote, "He was born into the firm, but never trained for its shadows. Now he wishes to return, but with a cost we cannot yet define." At the heart of the dilemma was this: how do you reintegrate a prince who publicly torched the institution without looking weak? The monarchy is built on continuity, not forgiveness. But this wasn't about image anymore. This was about family. About a father who had already lost a son emotionally and feared he might now lose him physically. The next call Harry made was to his grandmother's former private secretary, Sir Edward Young, a man who had once helped guide Queen Elizabeth through some of her most sensitive public crises. Sir Edward, though retired, remained an influential voice in royal affairs and had always treated Harry with a measured kind of respect. They met quietly in a Windsor cottage days later. The meeting was brief but powerful. Harry outlined a proposed role. Not as a senior royal, but as a behind-the-scenes contributor. He offered to take on veterans' initiatives, mental health work, and charitable foundations. No speaking tours. No tell-alls. Just work. Sir Edward reportedly said, "If you mean this, you'll need to prove it. With action, not words." Harry nodded. But the path back was not just a matter of institutional policy. It was deeply emotional. Princess and arranged a private family roundtable. No press, no staff, just the core royals. Present were Charles, William, and Camilla. The meeting took place at Sandringham in a room that once hosted discussions about the Sussexes' initial departure. There, Harry made his case. He spoke plainly, without notes. He acknowledged his past actions. He expressed regret, not just for the damage done to the institution, but for the personal toll it took on his relationships. He didn't apologize for leaving, but he did apologize for how he left. William listened, arms crossed. And, as always, observed quietly. Charles looked exhausted. Camilla said little, but her expression remained tense. After Harry finished, the room was silent. Then William, in a rare moment of candor, asked, "Do you understand that trust doesn't rebuild with words? It builds with silence, with loyalty, with time?" Harry nodded. "I'm ready." It was agreed, tentatively, that he would begin by shadowing royal engagements, not as a participant, but as an observer. He would live in a separate residence near Windsor. There would be no announcement, no title restoration, and absolutely no media engagement for at least 6 months. If he proved himself consistent, dependable, and discreet, a formal role could be discussed in 2026. But the real complication remained Meghan. What would her response be to a reintegration plan that excluded her completely? Harry was honest. She didn't support it. Not now. Maybe not ever. He told the family that they were in a deeply fragile place, and that he could not promise how things would unfold between them. But he made one thing clear: this decision was his. William, ever the strategist, saw the long game. If Harry could be reabsorbed quietly, without triggering global headlines, it would serve not just the monarchy's image, but its internal cohesion. And agreed. He doesn't need a crown. He needs a compass, she reportedly said as the meeting adjourned. And so, quietly and without fanfare, the wheels began turning. A temporary residence was secured for Harry near Windsor. Security protocols were updated. A small staff was assigned, none from his previous team. Palace aides were instructed to keep all planning off digital records. Only 3 media liaisons were briefed, and all were told the same thing: this is not a comeback. This is a recovery. Back in Montecito, however, the effects were already being felt. Meghan's camp had gone silent. Rumors of a major Netflix project being canceled began circulating. Paparazzi noted an unusual absence of Harry from public sightings. Meghan's inner circle grew tight-lipped, and behind her polished public appearances, there were whispers of a woman scrambling to hold on to something slipping through her grasp. Because as Harry quietly made plans to re-enter the only life he had ever truly known, he had already begun stepping away from the one they built together. And for the royal family, one thing became increasingly clear. This wasn't just about healing a brotherhood or salvaging a name. This was about survival. And the cost of letting him return might be nothing compared to the cost of turning him away again. Meghan Markle was never the kind of woman to crumble easily. Throughout her adult life, she had navigated television studios, courtrooms, tabloids, and palaces with a mixture of charm, intelligence, and relentless ambition. She had taken punches from the British press, faced the cold rejection of senior royals, and survived explosive interviews that shook the monarchy to its core. But none of those experiences prepared her for the quiet unraveling that began the moment she realized Prince Harry was slipping away, not into another scandal, but into the very institution they had burned bridges to escape. When Harry told her he had spoken with Princess and William, she initially refused to believe it. Not because she thought he was lying, but because the idea was too absurd. After everything, the Megxit fallout, the media blitz, the Oprah interview, the Spotify departures, the Netflix negotiations, how could Harry possibly think about going back? To her, it was like returning to the scene of a crime. But this wasn't some hypothetical. It was happening. Slowly, beneath the surface, but with the inevitability of a rising tide. Harry wasn't asking for her permission. He was informing her of his intent. For a woman who had built her life around strategic image-making and joint narratives, this new development was both terrifying and destabilizing. He was detaching, not just emotionally, but operationally. He had made calls, attended meetings, and begun drafting his own path, one that didn't include her at all. That night, Meghan retreated into the private den on the second floor of their Montecito estate. It was a room filled with scripts, correspondence, and mood boards for future projects. Here, she had once dreamed up brand ideas, outlined potential book deals, even rehearsed parts of their infamous 2021 interview. But now, the space felt foreign, like a theater set built for a character she no longer recognized. She called her longtime advisor, a crisis PR veteran from Los Angeles known for navigating celebrity divorces and brand collapses. According to insiders, the call was frantic. Meghan wanted to know how much of Harry's plan had already leaked. Was there chatter in the media? Were the tabloids sniffing around Windsor? Had someone at Netflix heard anything? The advisor's response was measured but cautious. No leaks yet. But the moment he steps foot in London, it won't stay quiet. You need to prepare. Prepare. That word echoed in Meghan's mind. She had always prepared, for roles, for interviews, for events, for public scrutiny. But this felt different. This wasn't about fixing an image or managing headlines. This was about the disintegration of everything she had spent 5 years building. Within hours, Meghan's inner circle had assembled in what insiders referred to as an emergency communications huddle. Her legal team was briefed. Her business manager advised delaying any upcoming brand launches. Even her stylist was told to shift public appearance plans, less Hollywood, more humanitarian, more modest. The goal: reposition Meghan as an independent, virtuous figure in the public eye should a formal separation with Harry become reality. It wasn't just optics that worried Meghan. It was access. Access to the royal sphere. Access to resources. Access to the children's titles, which were now even more in question than before. Behind the scenes, legal experts began revisiting the intricacies of royal status and custody, particularly as they pertained to Archie and Lilibet. While both children had been publicly recognized with royal lineage, the finer details of their entitlements, like protection, titles, and financial trust inclusion, were murky at best. And with Harry now flirting with reintegration into royal life without his wife, questions began to swirl. Would the royal family seek to gain formal guardianship? Would Harry attempt to bring the children to the UK? Would Meghan be painted as an obstructionist mother? All of these possibilities were terrifying. But the one thing that frightened Meghan the most was the prospect of total irrelevance. If Harry returned to the fold and publicly distanced himself from her, Meghan would no longer be the woman who escaped the monarchy. She would be the woman who was left behind by someone who chose to return. The narrative would flip entirely. Public sympathy could shift. Media support could wane. Collaborations might evaporate. The palace had always been her antagonist. But without Harry, it might also become her replacement. So she acted. Swiftly. Meghan reached out to Oprah Winfrey's team, requesting a private sit-down that could be filmed discreetly, with the option to release only selected clips. The goal wasn't a tell-all. It was narrative control. If Harry's re-entry leaked, Meghan wanted to be ready with a story, a reason, a perspective that would draw empathy and hold the public's attention. Oprah declined. Politely, firmly, and without much explanation. That rejection hit Meghan harder than expected. Oprah had once been their greatest ally, a platform through which they had dismantled royal myths and positioned themselves as victims of institutional cruelty. But now, even Oprah seemed hesitant. According to one source familiar with the talk show host's thinking, Oprah feared becoming entangled in what was quickly beginning to resemble not a moral crusade, but a marital implosion. Meghan turned next to Gayle King. No luck. Gayle reportedly advised keeping things quiet and dignified. The message was becoming clear. No one wanted to pick a side. Not yet. Not when things were so unstable. For Meghan, the silence from her allies was deafening. She had invested heavily in creating a narrative around her identity, first as a feminist outsider thrust into the archaic world of monarchy, then as a survivor of systemic media abuse, and more recently, as a cultural entrepreneur committed to storytelling and female empowerment. But all of that now risked being overshadowed by the simplest, oldest headline in the book. A strange duchess, abandoned by prince. The press had already begun whispering. Without official confirmation, speculation flourished. Headlines began surfacing on low-tier gossip sites. Where is Prince Harry? And Meghan appears alone at charity event. Paparazzi reported fewer sightings of the couple together. A drone photograph emerged of Harry walking alone in Santa Barbara, visibly tense, head down. Meghan tried to get ahead of the wave. She scheduled an appearance at a local women's shelter, inviting press but instructing her team to keep the focus on the shelter's mission. The photos were elegant, Meghan smiling, embracing children, wearing subtle colors, no heavy makeup. The attempt was clear: reframe the narrative. Show leadership. Signal virtue. But the public was already sensing the shift. Comments flooded social media. Some sympathetic, some brutal. She looks sad, one follower wrote. Where's Harry? Asked another. Is this another PR stunt? A third quipped. The tide wasn't turning yet, but it was rippling. And behind closed doors, Meghan began to crack. Staffers reported increased tension in the house. Long hours in meetings. Emotional outbursts. One former aide, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the atmosphere as high-stakes theater, except no one's reading the same script anymore. Even her mother, Doria Ragland, reportedly urged her to slow down and focus on the children. But Meghan couldn't relax. Not when the man who had once been her fiercest defender was slowly disappearing into the arms of the very institution she believed had nearly destroyed them both. She reached out to Harry again. According to a source familiar with the interaction, Meghan arranged a private dinner at home. No staff, no distractions. Just the two of them. She cooked. She dressed simply. She tried to recreate the early intimacy they once shared in those first few months in Frogmore Cottage, when everything still felt like possibility. But Harry wasn't the same man. He was distant, polite, almost hollow. He ate, thanked her, and listened. But when she raised the question of his return to royal life, his expression hardened. This isn't about escaping you, he said. It's about not escaping myself anymore. She asked him if he still loved her. He didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his response was heartbreakingly complex. I don't know who I am with you anymore. And I don't know who you are with me. That was the moment Meghan realized that her greatest fear wasn't abandonment. It was irrelevance. Because even if they stayed married, even if they avoided headlines, the emotional core of their partnership, the shared purpose, the aligned vision, was disintegrating. And in its place stood a woman trying to rescue a brand, and a man trying to rescue his soul. Over the following weeks, Meghan began making contingency plans. Not divorce. Not yet. But separation of functions. She began exploring independent projects, solo documentaries, memoir-style essays, nonprofit ventures unrelated to the Archwell brand. She quietly reached out to her former acting agent in Toronto. She asked friends in Canada about properties. She wasn't moving, but she was preparing to move, mentally, emotionally, and possibly geographically, if the need arose. Because Harry had made his choice. And Meghan, for the first time in years, was no longer the author of the story. She was a character in someone else's chapter. And as she sat alone in her Montecito den, The walls that had once been filled with vision boards and strategy notes now felt like a tomb of ambition, a place built for a future that may never come. Prince Harry had spent most of his adult life running from ghosts. From the flashbulbs that haunted every sidewalk, from the shadows of his mother's death, from the unrelenting gaze of public expectation. He ran into battlefields in Afghanistan hoping that combat would drown the noise of cameras. He ran into Hollywood thinking he could build a life of purpose wrapped in reinvention. But as it turned out, no matter how far he ran, something was always waiting, gnawing at him quietly from within. It wasn't until his body finally forced him to stop that Harry realized he had been ignoring the loudest alarm of all. It happened one afternoon, weeks before his decision to reach out to Princess and William. Harry had been experiencing persistent exhaustion, chronic headaches, muscle weakness, and occasional memory fog. At first, he brushed it off as jet lag, poor sleep, maybe stress. But when he collapsed in their Montecito home, his vision tunneling, his breath shallow, Meghan panicked and summoned their private physician. Blood work, neurological scans, and extensive consultations followed. And the final diagnosis was something Harry had never expected to hear. An autoimmune condition. Aggressive. Complicated. And according to doctors, very likely triggered or worsened by prolonged emotional stress and psychological trauma. It wasn't terminal. Not immediately life-threatening. But it was serious. Harry would need to drastically alter his lifestyle, regulate sleep, eliminate emotional stressors, reduce exposure to media triggers, adopt a disciplined health regimen. Most importantly, the doctors warned, sustained psychological pressure will only accelerate the damage. This wasn't a health scare that could be solved with medicine alone. It was a demand from his body to completely reorient how he lived. And for Harry, that meant looking at his life with brutal honesty. He had thought California would heal him. The sunny mornings, the ocean air, the freedom from palace rigidity. But somehow, he had become more fragmented. The very thing that was meant to be his escape, celebrity, had become his new confinement. Every deal, every camera, every narrative carefully constructed and then shredded by critics. Each became a brick in the wall of his silent suffering. After the diagnosis, Harry began withdrawing even more. Meghan noticed it immediately. He spent hours in the garden, staring into nothing. He skipped public appearances. He canceled interviews. His emails went unanswered. The only calls he took were from his doctor and, occasionally, his therapist. The sessions were intense. There, without cameras or handlers, Harry began unpacking not just the trauma of the past year, but the unhealed wounds from childhood. He spoke about walking behind Diana's coffin as a boy and the numbness that followed him for years. About the nights he would wake up sweating, remembering the sound of flashing cameras and screaming voices. About the guilt of leaving the military, the shame of failed royal duties, and the confusion of becoming a brand instead of a human being. And he admitted something deeply personal. He didn't know who he was without crisis. His entire life had been defined by responding either to tragedy, to duty, to love, or to conflict. When he left the royal family, he thought he was taking control. But he had merely found a new chaos, dressed in glamour. In therapy, a phrase kept recurring: fight or flight. Harry had spent years in that mode. Fight the press. Fight the family. Fly to another country. Fight for his wife. Fight for his privacy. But now, he was too tired to fight, and too ill to flee. The diagnosis was both his prison and his permission. For the first time, he was being told, scientifically, medically, unavoidably, that the lifestyle he had built was incompatible with his survival. So he began asking himself the questions that would eventually reshape his future. What do I want to be remembered for? What matters if the cameras turn off tomorrow? Who am I when no one is looking? In those quiet, painful days, Harry stopped reading the news. He stopped checking social media. He deleted apps that tracked media mentions. For the first time, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was necessary. He began reading books on resilience, on grief, on trauma recovery. He revisited military journals from his days in Afghanistan. He found himself thinking constantly about his mother, not the public Diana, but the private one. The woman who read him bedtime stories, who held his hand on stormy nights. He remembered her telling him once, "Service is not about applause. It's about presence." That memory hit him like lightning. Presence, not performance, not branding, just being there. For people, for causes, for purpose. It was the beginning of clarity. Harry started waking earlier, walking alone before sunrise. He spoke to veterans he hadn't called in years. He reconnected with staff from his Invictus Games project. He asked his doctor to help him design a daily health protocol rooted not in fame, but in structure, meditation, nutrition, controlled exposure to media, and therapy twice weekly, no exceptions. He also began journaling, not for a memoir, not for public release, just for himself. In those pages, he confessed his fear that he was becoming a shell of the man Meghan had fallen in love with, that their marriage had become a performance piece, that their brand had eaten their bond. But the most heartbreaking entry was when his therapist asked him to write a letter to himself at age 12. He wrote, "I'm sorry you didn't get to grow up normal. I'm sorry we lost her. I'm sorry I let the world define you. But I'm here now. And I'm not going to let this version of you disappear for someone else's approval." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant for cameras. But it was real. And it was that letter that finally gave him the courage to call Princess in. The diagnosis didn't just mark a turning point for Harry's health. It became the frame through which he viewed his entire life. Everything from his fight with Meghan to the collapse of their projects, to the calls with William, now seemed part of a deeper journey. He wasn't just fleeing from his wife or chasing a royal title. He was trying to survive himself. When the palace was discreetly informed of Harry's condition, the tone shifted. Even Camilla, who had been cold in the past, reportedly told Charles he needs healing, not headlines. Princess and urged privacy and protection. William, while still reserved, agreed that this wasn't about protocol, it was about family. Even courtiers known for their skepticism softened once they read medical reports shared under strict confidentiality. Harry's request was simple. He wasn't seeking a full return. He didn't want a press tour. He wasn't looking for redemption in the public eye. He just wanted to serve quietly from the sidelines, in roles that gave him purpose without exposing him to the toxicity that had nearly killed him. Charles, after days of deliberation, agreed to meet privately. No aides, no press. That meeting, sources say, was one of the most emotional exchanges between father and son in over a decade. Harry reportedly told him, "I don't blame you anymore. I just want to live. And I can't do it this way." Charles listened. He didn't interrupt. When Harry explained the impact his condition was having, and the direct link to stress and media toxicity, the king teared up. "You are my son," he reportedly said, "and I will not lose another one." From that moment on, plans began to form. Harry would return to the UK in a non-public capacity, at least temporarily. A private apartment would be secured for him near Windsor. He would undergo routine medical evaluations and be given space to focus on recovery and private service work. The palace agreed to silence. No press briefings. No official statements. This was to be a healing process, not a media stunt. Back in Montecito, Meghan was informed. Her response, according to a close friend, was one of conflicted emotion. She was worried about his health. She didn't question the diagnosis, but she feared the direction it was pushing him, back into the arms of a system that had once nearly destroyed them both. But for Harry, the return wasn't about the system. It was about the silence he needed to survive. He would no longer be performing for a world that didn't understand him. He would no longer destroy his body for a brand. He would no longer sacrifice himself to hold together something that was quietly falling apart. The diagnosis was a curse, but it was also a revelation. And in that revelation, Harry found the one thing he had been missing all along: a reason to come home. When Prince Harry walked into Clarence's house under strict secrecy, there were no photographers, no flags, no announcements, just silence and a firm winter breeze pressing against the stone walls of a royal institution that had, for decades, struggled with change, yet now found itself staring into the face of its most unpredictable test of loyalty and blood. Harry arrived with no entourage. Just a single bodyguard and a leather folder tucked under his arm containing handwritten notes, personal reflections, and a quietly composed document titled, "Proposal for Service Re-Engagement, Prince Henry of Wales." It wasn't drafted by lawyers. It wasn't prepared by a team of strategists. It was Harry's voice, unfiltered. A plan that spoke more to duty than entitlement, more to contribution than controversy. King Charles III, recently returned from a brief visit to Sandringham, had agreed to this meeting after days of quiet contemplation. The diagnosis had changed things. Harry's willingness to come alone, without media leverage or Meghan by his side, had softened the resistance of even the most cautious palace aides. Still, no one knew what to expect. The wounds from Harry's departure, especially after the explosive Oprah interview, hadn't fully healed. Many feared this was another episode, temporary emotion masquerading as resolve. But when Harry entered the room, there was no performance, no flair, only clarity. The first few minutes were personal, father and son, a conversation less about royalty and more about life. Harry apologized for the timing of his exit from royal life years earlier, not for the decision, but for the chaos it caused. He explained the emotional exhaustion, the fear, the sense of losing himself under a microscope he never asked for. Charles listened, his face lined with both skepticism and sorrow. Then, Harry presented his proposal. It was divided into 3 phases. Phase 1. Quiet reintegration. Harry would take on 2 internal, non-public-facing charitable initiatives under the direction of Princess and the Duke of Edinburgh. One focused on veterans' mental health. The other, environmental youth leadership. He would not appear at public events. He would not speak on behalf of the crown. He would work from within, anonymously when possible. Phase 2. Service pilot projects. Pending health stability and institutional feedback, Harry would launch a pilot initiative modeled after Invictus, this time for wounded humanitarian aid workers and frontline responders across the Commonwealth. A joint venture under the umbrella of the Royal Foundation but operated with complete transparency and oversight. Phase 3. Long-term integration review. After 18 months, if no breaches of confidentiality, public conflict, or brand crossovers occurred, a formal role within the working royal family could be reconsidered, limited in scope but lasting in intention. He ended the proposal with a simple line: "I ask not for restoration, but for redemption through service." Charles sat in silence. Across the room, his senior private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, took detailed notes. Queen Camilla was not present. It had been decided early on that her involvement in this initial conversation might risk derailing the emotional balance. Camilla had been among the most hurt by the Oprah revelations. Her position remained firm but distant. After the proposal, Charles looked up and said, "You've written this yourself?" Harry nodded. Every word. The next few days were filled with behind-the-scenes deliberations. While Charles appreciated the sincerity of Harry's pitch, he knew reintegration was not simply a father's decision. It was a matter of monarchy. The public had to be considered. The press. The rest of the family. And most importantly, the precedent. If Harry returned in any formal capacity, what message would that send? Could it invite more scrutiny? Could it reopen wounds? Princess Anne was brought in as a mediator. She met with Harry separately, this time not as an aunt, but as the firm's most respected foot soldier. Her feedback was surprisingly positive. She noted Harry's humility, his focus, his awareness of the damage done. But she also warned Charles, redemption cannot be rushed. The firm is not a therapy room. If he truly wants to serve, he must accept that the spotlight will never fully vanish. Only his response to it can change. William, who had remained distant during earlier phases, now requested a private meeting. For years, the brothers had spoken through clenched teeth and filtered texts. But this was different. William agreed to meet Harry not at Clarence House or Kensington, but at a private estate in Berkshire where they had once played as children. There, with no press, no advisors, and no schedules, they walked. What followed, insiders say, was not a reconciliation, but a reckoning. William aired years of frustration, pain, and disbelief. He accused Harry of abandoning his post, of shaming the family for global entertainment. He said the Oprah interview had nearly broken their father's spirit. But he also admitted something deeper. He missed his brother. He missed the camaraderie, the old jokes, the shared memories of a mother who had once anchored them both. Harry listened. He didn't interrupt. He apologized again, this time not from the voice of a prince, but from a brother who had lost himself. He told William he didn't expect public forgiveness, just space to earn his place again, not as a favorite son, but as a working man who knew now what purpose really meant. By the end of that walk, William didn't make promises, but he did make a decision. He would not block Harry's proposal. He would monitor it closely. He would advise his father to proceed cautiously. Charles, hearing the recommendations from and William, finally agreed, but with conditions. Harry would reside in the Nottingham Cottage Annex near Windsor, not at Frogmore, not at Kensington. He would attend weekly health check-ins and therapy. He would have no involvement in state matters, no public statements on behalf of the monarchy, and no collaborative engagements with Meghan or any commercial enterprise tied to Archewell. A new clause was added to the agreement. Any breach of discretion or unauthorized communication with press regarding internal affairs would result in permanent removal from all royal functions. Harry agreed to every term without hesitation. The next challenge was the staff. A small, trusted team was assigned to manage Harry's reintegration. This included a former aide from his military days, 2 logistical officers under Princess Anne's department, and a mental health coordinator from the Royal Foundation. Security was assigned with minimal visibility. Every precaution was taken to ensure that his return would not feel like a media event. The goal was not optics. It was healing. The official line, should the press inquire, would be this: the Duke of Sussex is currently involved in private charitable support projects under the Royal Foundation umbrella. No further details will be shared at this time. Back in California, the silence from Harry's end became deafening for Meghan. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that his proposal would fall apart, that Charles would refuse, that William would push back, that Harry would change his mind. But as the days turned into weeks and his absence stretched, it became clear he wasn't just testing the waters. He was wading back in. Her legal team asked if she wished to request formal updates. She declined. There were no legal separations filed, no custody demands issued. But the distance between them was no longer emotional. It was geographical, institutional, and intentional. Harry, in Windsor, began the slow, quiet work of reintegration. He attended briefings. He reviewed foundation reports. He visited, in secret, a veteran recovery facility in Kent. No cameras, no speeches, just a walk among the wounded, listening to stories, offering quiet encouragement. His presence wasn't announced, but word spread quietly within inner circles. One retired Royal Marine who met him said he was different, calmer, like he was listening for the first time. The palace noted his conduct. No leaks, no outbursts, no diva moments, just structure, discipline, peace. Charles, watching from afar, reportedly wrote in a private journal entry, "Perhaps the boy has found the man, and the man, his place." But even as things appeared to settle, one looming question remained. Was this return permanent? Or was it a reprieve from a storm that might return stronger? For now, the palace was content with the present. Harry was healing. The family was stabilizing. And the press, surprisingly, had not broken the story. Yet, because what came next would change everything, not from within the palace, but from the world Harry left behind. And Meghan, watching from the hills of Montecito, was preparing for what might be the hardest decision of her life. In the weeks following Harry's discreet return to the UK, Meghan Markle's world began to feel less like a fortress and more like a vacuum. Montecito, once a place of purpose and prestige, now echoed with uncertainty. The grand halls of their California mansion, typically filled with planning sessions, staff meetings, and the orchestrated machinery of a global brand, began to feel hollow. The man who had once shared every breath of this venture was gone, not just physically, but emotionally, perhaps permanently. From the outside, nothing had changed. Meghan was still attending select engagements. She smiled in photos, maintained her carefully curated presence on social media, and continued holding high-level conversations about philanthropic ventures. But inside, according to those close to her, she was unraveling. The first signs were subtle. She stopped sleeping through the night. She began rereading old emails from Harry, revisiting moments in their shared timeline, looking for signs, missed signals, clues that could explain how the man who once said, "You're my family now," had become someone she barely recognized. What haunted Meghan most wasn't the fear of being alone. It was the fear of becoming invisible. She had spent years building a legacy alongside Harry. Their image wasn't just about love. It was about rebellion, courage, truth. Together, they had defied the monarchy, walked away from an empire, and launched a new model of power. But now, that partnership was splintering, and in its place was a narrative she couldn't control. Friends described her as restless, distracted, borderline frantic. The media hadn't yet picked up on Harry's reintegration, but insiders knew it was only a matter of time. And once it broke, the headlines would be brutal. The Duchess abandoned. Meghan left behind. The royal who crawled back home, alone. She had anticipated backlash in the past. She had prepared for racist commentary, royal pushback, and tabloid smears. But this, being quietly discarded by the man she built a kingdom with, this was something different. It wasn't an attack from the outside. It was a collapse from within. Her team tried to maintain composure. Staff were instructed to keep operations steady, continue project development, and act as though nothing had changed. But Meghan couldn't hide the truth from her closest confidants. They began receiving frantic late-night calls. Some days she cried. Other days she was angry, lashing out at perceived betrayal, questioning why Harry hadn't fought harder to find a solution that included her. She reportedly told a close friend during one call, "He was supposed to protect us. He was supposed to protect me. And now he's walking back into the arms of people who tried to destroy me." And then came the silence. Harry stopped responding to her texts as frequently. He would go days without checking in. His tone became clinical, focused solely on updates about the children or financial logistics. The warmth was gone. When she brought up the idea of joining him in the UK, even temporarily, he shut it down. Politely. Firmly. "It's not time," he reportedly told her. "This space is helping me think. Helping me breathe." To Meghan, the message was clear. He didn't want her there. And as those days stretched into weeks, the media narrative began shifting as well. Though no official statements were released, eagle-eyed reporters started asking questions. Why was Meghan appearing alone at events? Why hadn't Harry been seen in California? Why had he stopped podcast appearances, interviews, and public commentary? A blurry photo surfaced on a gossip blog showing Harry near Windsor, walking with a senior palisade. Within hours, speculation exploded. Royal reintegration? Solo return? Is Meghan out? Her team scrambled to manage the rumors. Meghan herself contemplated issuing a statement, but was advised against it. Anything she said could be interpreted as hostile or desperate. But saying nothing, doing nothing, made her feel helpless. The one ally Meghan had hoped to rely on, her mother, Doria, grew concerned about her daughter's emotional state. Doria urged her to focus on wellness, reminding her of the strength she had shown during their darkest days in the UK. But even Meghan's resilience was now fraying. She began experiencing panic attacks. Brief, sharp moments of breathlessness where her vision narrowed and her chest tightened. They didn't last long, but they were frequent enough to worry her inner circle. A therapist was called. Private sessions resumed. But even there, Meghan struggled. Because the problem wasn't just the possibility of divorce. It was identity. Without Harry beside her, Meghan feared the narrative would swallow her. She would no longer be the outspoken duchess who challenged a monarchy. She would be the wife left behind. Worse, she could be painted as the reason he left in the first place. She imagined the headlines. Meghan, the manipulator. Prince Harry finally sees the light. Royal family vindicated. And perhaps most painful of all, was it all just a phase? In the darkest corners of her mind, Meghan began wondering if she had overestimated the bond between them. Had she misread Harry's strength? Had she pushed him too far? Or had she simply been a chapter in his long search for purpose? Every answer hurt. In her desperation to hold on to something real, Meghan began making inquiries into her own future, separate from Harry. She asked her legal team to quietly explore what a private financial restructuring might look like if Archwell were to split. She reviewed the prenup. She initiated early talks with branding agents about solo campaigns. It wasn't a divorce filing. Not yet. But it was preparation. Because if Harry wasn't coming back, if he truly meant to serve again alone, then she needed to be ready. And while the outside world remained largely in the dark, those closest to her saw the toll. The once unshakable woman who had stood in front of millions with Oprah, who had penned heartfelt op-eds and narrated inspirational documentaries, now sat alone in her Montecito kitchen late at night, sipping tea that had long gone cold, staring out into the dark California hills. Every now and then, she would check her phone, hoping for a message from him. A voice note. A sign. Sometimes it came. Most times, it didn't. And when it did, it was never what she hoped for. Just logistics. Nothing personal. Nothing that tethered him back to her emotionally. She tried writing him a letter, longhand, emotional, raw. She placed it in an envelope and held it for days. But in the end, she never sent it. Instead, she locked it in a drawer and told herself she would wait. Wait for clarity. Wait for an answer. Wait for Harry to remember the life they built. But deep down, she feared he already had. And he had chosen something else. Something quieter. Something older. Something royal. In a move that has stunned the royal inner circle, Prince Harry is reportedly preparing to return to royal duties, alone. No cameras. No Netflix. And, shockingly, no Meghan. Sources close to the palace reveal that Harry has secretly reached out to Princess and Prince William, saying the words that have rocked Montecito to its core: "I want to serve again. Alone, if I must." Now, With his health in crisis and his marriage on the brink, Meghan Markle is said to be spiraling, terrified of losing her place in the royal orbit forever. What drove Harry back to the institution he once fled? Why did he shut Meghan out? And is this the beginning of the final chapter for the Sussexes? Stay with us. What you're about to hear changes everything.